Hey, all you beautiful ethic cuties and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, what the heck's wrong with you? It's free. Welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you think fixing our workplaces can fix our world, I got a real treat for you today. I know I say that a lot, but I really, really mean it this time. We're talking about ethics fails with the one and only Dr. Bettina Palazzo and the one and only Christian Hunt. Let's get a massive emoji exposure as I run through these. We're off to a great start. I got a feeling we're going to break a record, so we're trying to get past 5,000 emojis today. We're off to a phenomenal start. So those of you in the waiting room, glad you got your emoji fingers fired up. If you have not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, if for no other reason, then these get to show up automatically on your calendar and you can peruse which ones you want to attend. You get free CEUs every single week. So we give out thousands of CEUs. We are very committed to providing thought leadership to this amazing community that we're all a part of. And so if you're part of SHRM or you're part of HRCI or you have a certification through HCCA or SCCE, you know, the Compliance Certification Board, then this is the place for you. Free CEUs every single week. We also are giving away tons of books. We love giving away books because readers are leaders. I don't even like making money around here. I just like giving away books. So check out on the console, there's a button to see all the thought leadership that's part of the Ethico library that you can pull from. And also think about tuning in to this cool series I'm doing with the one and only Tom Fox, the voice of compliance. We are talking about how to actually use AI. You know, everybody's talking about AI at such a, you know, freaking surface level. We're diving deep across a number of different components of a program, talking about how you can leverage AI today to start moving the needle, start eliminating some of that busy work and really focusing your attention on the things that matter most. So here's a little clip so you can wet your beak. That's really what it all boils down to. So when we're not making good bets with our time, or we're spending time on things that are not moving the needle, or we're just picking one piece of straw, hoping, fingers crossed, that we find that needle in the haystack, it kind of presents a vulnerability to our programs and to our careers at the end of the day.
Nick, I'm beginning to think I should quit sending you outlines because you say things that I want to take this whole podcast in a completely different way. And I've heard you use this phrase before, but it just struck me when you said it again. And that phrase is crowdsourcing risk intelligence at scale.
All right, so imagine that. Who needs an outline? We are just diving deep on, AI. So there are several episodes. There's a white paper that Ethico puts out along with every single episode that corresponds to the book that Tom just put out. So you got to follow that. And if you have not subscribed to the Ethico YouTube channel, pull out your phone right now or open a new tab, jump over to YouTube, search for Ethico, hit subscribe, and then go through all those things and hit like all of those things. That would be phenomenal. But if you can share insights that you're getting from the Ethicsverse, or you can invite some friends, that's the best way that we can all grow this community together, because our network is our net worth. So if you have not dropped your LinkedIn URL in the chat yet, go ahead and do that. Neither of those two things are big enough, your network or your net worth, and you got to take advantage of this community that we are all a part of. And you also got to take advantage of the one and only Ethicsverse book giveaway, which is in live effect today. So if you have not read Christian Hunt's highly reviewed book, Humanizing Rules, today is your chance to win a copy. And if you don't feel like typing in the chat today, all good. Go to Amazon and pick this up. This is money well spent. This deserves a permanent spot right on your nightstand. So we're giving away 5 of these today for those of you, those of us who are most participatory in the chat. Today we are talking about ethical F-ups. And, we want this to be a closed door session where we can really share and really learn from each other. So win yourself a book. Also, I've been talking about this the last couple of weeks. This is your last chance to take advantage of the Promised Land promotion. So Ethico, we want to put our money where our mouth is. We're not the right company for everybody. That's all good. But we're the right company for a lot of people, especially if you have current pain points with current providers, particularly these legacy providers. So up to 15% off, up to a year free. If you're looking for new case management, new whistleblower solution, new disclosure platform, new risk assessment tool, you want to bolt on some exit interviews to get some more of that risk intelligence that you can actually respond to, or maybe your analytics program isn't working. We help folks drive a lot more engagement, drive a lot more efficiency in that process, in that compliance process, ultimately so we can rest, calmly at night knowing that our program is effective and can withstand outside scrutiny. So I want to talk a little bit about this risk assessment tool that we've launched. It's gotten a lot of great feedback. It's picking up a lot of traction in the market, which is phenomenal. And again, it's insights from folks like you that have built all of our tools, and the risk assessment is the same way. Informed by people on the front lines to really get more of that risk intelligence.
Risk assessment season, let's get started. So I'm going to need Google Forms, spreadsheets, emails, calendar.
Introducing Ethico's new risk assessment module, your one-stop solution for managing organizational risk. Our intuitive platform streamlines the entire risk assessment lifecycle. Create customized assessments with our drag-and-drop interface, distribute assessments with secure magic links, and boost completion rates with automated reminders and real-time monitoring. Transform raw data into actionable insights with dynamic heat maps and visual risk matrices. Drill down into critical risk areas requiring immediate attention across your organization. The new risk assessment module for MySim. Reach out to your client success manager to learn more.
Or just hit that demo button on your console and someone will reach out to you directly. And listen, look at all of these awards. I can't, you're not gonna hear me stop talking about these awards because I'm so proud of them. Momentum leader, grid leader, easiest to do business with, best webinars, we need one up there for that as well. But go ahead and book a demo if you wanna see how you can leverage this tool that really gets you faster cycles on specific risks for bite-sized risk assessments, or you can load up your entire annual risk assessment process into it and get some heat maps to, again, direct your limited resources to the things that are going to move the needle the most. Speaking of moving the needle, on July 24th, okay, we are less than a month away. We have the second annual Ethicsverse Day. So we're going to have four amazing sessions, up to 12 CEUs if you attend them all, across a number of different topics that I think are really going to add value. We hate these surface level webinars around here. We want to dive deep and provide you some actual actionable insights that you can take day one after you hear it and start implementing within your program. So we're going to be talking about AI. We have a whistleblower, FBI informant panel. We have former DOJ folks, and the one and only Hema Lomax is going to come talking about mindset. So much of our limited impact is due to our limited mindset, and we all have limitations in our mindset, so we're going to be diving deep on all that. So circle your calendar in red, block that day off with some PTO, and come on July 24th for an awesome day, ton of giveaways and so forth. Before we dive in, one other thing I want to talk about, the Compliance Cappuccino Club. So if you don't know Christian Hunt, and if you don't know Dr. Palazzo, you absolutely should, first of all, follow them both on LinkedIn. But Bettina, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Compliance Cappuccino Club, because people absolutely love this thing that you made.
Yes, it's my newsletter, so you get invigorating content regularly. And the other thing is that every 2 months, I have a little online mastermind circle where I propose just one hot compliance topic, from training completion to how to win your leaders, how to make them listen. And it's very simple. I usually just say some words about my experience and what I've seen in my long experience in the field. And then we open the floor and share. And it's very valuable because everybody sees, oh, we have the same challenges. That's very comforting. And we also, every time I'm amazed how much inspiration and new ideas we create. So it's really a community thing, like very similar to what you are trying to create here so well.
Trying?
Yeah. So at the minute I said trying, I thought now that you are doing
I'm just joking. But sign up for that. It's really phenomenal. Okay, so we have, like I said, we have Christian Hunt, we have Bettina Palazzo, you have me, 3 futuristic astronauts fixing our spaceship in the midst of a asteroid storm. We're going to be talking about ethical F-ups today. So I want to kind of pass it over to you, Christian. What are we talking about today? Why is it important for us to revisit these ethical F-ups? See how close I'm getting to that PG-13 line? I'm dancing on the line here. Talk to us a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. And also, off to a phenomenal start. We're halfway toward our goal. We're at 2,200 already. So awesome. I love it. Okay, over to you, Christian.
Amazing. Look, thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure and thank you for having us back, both Nick. A pleasure to be here. Look, the background to what we're going to talk about was Bettina and I have known each other for some time, and we kind of keep bumping into each other at various events and kind of similar areas of interest. And we were like, what can we do together that would be interesting? And we mulled over all kinds of ideas, and we stumbled on this idea that people in kind of ethics and compliance are expected to solve the world's problems and make sure that nothing goes wrong. And one of the things that we don't often talk about is when they do, because if your job is to prevent F-ups, things from going wrong, then the idea of talking about having got things wrong when your job is to do the opposite is kind of challenging. And so we took inspiration from the tech industry, which has, and I will avoid using the word, Nick, to be sensitive, but the tech has these F-up nights. And so in tech, they talk about things that went wrong. And we suddenly had this inspiration, and we just thought, wouldn't it be really interesting if we could find a way to get people in our space to be talking about the stuff that goes, because it's easy to talk about the stuff that goes right. It's the stuff that goes wrong that we can really learn from. And so we set about this challenge of, can we get people in our space, in a room, virtual, to have conversations they wouldn't ordinarily have, because we're all human and we all make mistakes and things aren't always going to go according to plan. And we just thought it might be quite a fun thing to do, to just get some people together, see what we do that. So we've now done 3 of these things. We did, and the difference is purely just when we hosted it. So we did one on a European friendly time, one on America's friendly time, and they're just this morning our time. So that would be in the middle of the night for most of you. We did one at an Asia friendly time. And really the idea being that if we can start to share things that have gone wrong, one, we can learn from it ourselves, and the lessons, we can come on and look at what those lessons are. Pretty interesting. But the second thing is, it's just human and honest. And like, if we pretend everything's perfect when it's not, we're going to miss opportunities to learn stuff. And we all know in our private lives we've got things wrong. And so the basic principle was that. So we think it's just really important to talk about this stuff. Bettina, it's probably a good idea for you to just explain why this is challenging for people in our space.
Yes, I noticed ever since I'm in this field that nobody expects other departments to be pristine and immaculate, like controlling, finance, HR. But somehow the expectation is very high for compliance, because it's the very role that you have to be perfect, because you're looking out for other people not to make mistakes, not to do misconduct. So that's one important aspect. And the other one is that it runs even deeper if we talk more about ethics. Also in ethics, we have this kind of common perception that either you are ethical, good person, bad person. But that's, we know now with behavioral science a lot that we all are a very messy mix, and it depends very much on the context. So that's why I think it's very difficult. So with this thing that we have, it's somehow in our culture. It's then you add school, where you are basically trained to hide your mistakes or avoid mistakes no matter what, and not see it as a learning opportunity.
Yeah, and to that point,
I'm happy to hear more about. Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, and to that point, I think just hearing, we kind of live in this Instagram world where we see kind of the surface level of things, and we draw our own conclusions from those things. And it's easy to, think about, man, my house is so messy, my program is not really where I need it to be. And then I come on a webinar or I hear somebody speaking and think that there's no F-ups kind of behind the scenes there. And I think it's a very sort of invigorating, or it's kind of an empowering thing for me at least, to hear other people that I look up to, the struggles that they've had. Not only does it humanize them, but it also helps me see, like, okay, well, me falling down as I'm climbing this mountain, it doesn't mean I shouldn't be climbing the mountain. It means that you fall down when you climb mountains. And when you try to do hard things, or you try to do big things don't always go according to plan. And that's normal, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm. But still, we are very much hardwired also biologically for this too, because we want to stay safe. So we always scan the horizon for bad things that could happen to us. So this negativity bias is with all of us, and it's hard.
So I'm glad we are in the trust tree. We are in a bubble of safety and love with all of us who are part of the Ethicsverse. So I want to dive in. So as we're talking about some of these F-ups that, you guys have uncovered in your various sessions around the world, and, kind of some more around kind of how this process has worked for you, I'd love to hear some of those from the chat, because I think, again, if we can share our victories, but also share the things that taught us lessons, we can really multiply across our community the lessons that we're learning without having to sort of fall off of that bike.
So yeah, and I think it's worth just sort of as people want to, if people want to put in things that have gone wrong from the chat, happy to explore those. One of the things that we realized, Nick, and this has been, what's been fascinating about setting these events up is that we've been learning as we go, and of course that the events themselves didn't run perfectly because the best laid plans will often have challenges. But one of the things that we realized was really, really important is if we're inviting other people to talk about mistakes that they have made, and we have to kind of lead by example. And so one of the things that we've been doing in the sessions is talking about the mistakes that we've made. So maybe this is a good opportunity for me I'll talk about the one that I talked about this morning, because most of your audience will have quite rightly been asleep while this was happening. So I'll talk about what I said this morning. And we've done these 3 sessions. So given I have been a compliance officer and a regulator, and now what I do at the moment, that was 3 different opportunities. So I talked once about something that had gone wrong as a compliance officer, once as something I'd messed up as a regulator. And this morning, I talked about something that had gone wrong for me in my current role. And it was relating to, thank you for the promotion, my book earlier on. So this book, Humanizing Rules here, and which is being nicely blurred. But anyway, so I had this idea that I would give a few copies of this book to a prospective client. And so I got the whole of the copies of the book, I personalized them for people, and I turned up. And this was a governmental organization. Now, I have been a regulator. I am fully aware that certain governmental organizations are not permitted to receive gifts of whatsoever. But I hadn't bothered to look at their policy. So I show up with these customized books, personally written to them, and said, here, present from me. And they're like, we cannot accept any gifts. And I kind of thought, oh, and I said, well, so, what's the limit? Because I'm sure we could find a way to get the gift under the limit, because I can go, well, this is my author's copy, right? So I bought them, so I would have got them at a cheaper rate than you. So maybe we can bring the number down. And of course, because I've written in them, they're not new. So I'm starting to do rationalization for how we can get around the rule. And then they said something, and they were like, yeah, that's interesting, but we have another policy that's designed to stop people getting around the rule. And that second policy is that even if it's not technically a gift, because I suggested maybe I could lend them the book for a long period of time. And they were like, there's a second rule that says if it is effectively a gift, in other words, if the substance is a gift, even if the form isn't, then it's still not permitted. And the thing that I thought was fascinating about this when I did it was firstly, look, I'm a former compliance officer, I'm a former regulator. I should know about these things. Hadn't occurred to me to look at their policy. But even then, I've got myself into the frame of trying to rationalize breaking this rule that they've clearly told me is not there. And what was interesting in the moment when it happened was they were also joining in, right? They were also kind of creatively thinking about this. And so off the back of me revealing that, and obviously I've taken, so I now have several copies of the book dedicated to people who can't actually receive it. So I'm looking out for people with the same names to give them away to, because I can't do anything else with it. Permanent memory on my bookshelf of this thing. But what's really interesting, we started to then explore off the back of that mistake, well, let's have a think about why does this happen? Well, we can look at rationalization. Well, I was ignorant of the rules. I didn't think to check them up. Didn't occur to me they exist. We see that frequently, people not knowing rules exist. It's very easy and quick to move into how do I get around this rule without thinking about what the rule is there for. And then that took us into a whole discussion about limits and how do you codify. If we think about gifts and entertainments as a good example, actually we put limits in place, but often those limits can be wrong. They can be too high or too low because they're generally applied across a set of situations and it might be sensible in one and not in another. And so there's a good illustration of how rules can be quite challenging. And so off this one little case study, we talked about a whole range of things and a few other people, and I'm going to spare their blushes if they are on the call, not talk about the things they mentioned. I'll stick to my own mistake. Quite a few things off this one effort.
Yeah, it was really,
so what are some of the things?
Sorry,
1 second. What are some of the things that came from that? I mean, it's kind of interesting, right? Because they're like, this is the ethics guy. This is the ethics consultant that we're going to be using here. The guy who can figure out how to pick the lock around the rules. I'm just kidding. Did you come up with the idea that maybe you can leave it on a bus and they could have just found the book, or would that have fallen into that second category? Kidding again.
That would definitely have fallen in that second category.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting. It's an interesting thought exercise because some of these F-ups are, candidly created by the policies that are in place. If they're not common sense policies, then you're either going to have a non-common sense policy sort of dictating behavior, or you're going to increase the likelihood that people are going to figure out ways kind of around a policy, either that doesn't make sense to them or that doesn't feel like it's common sense enough. Did you find some of that in your discussions around this kind of thought experiment?
Yeah, well, and where you end up with this particular case is having a zero limit is on the one hand ridiculous, right? How does business operate without, so you can't even give somebody a cup of coffee type logic, On the other hand, actually 0 is a very, like, it's clear. There's no confusion there whatsoever. So from a sort of compliability perspective, that 0 limit makes a ton of sense. It's a pain in the backside, but it's actually quite a sensible way of codifying the world. And so you start to then think, actually, things that are convenient for the purposes of policing them or convenient for the purposes of comprehension might not actually be practical in the real world. And so you start to see that if you think in those terms and you go, well, that's a policy that inevitably is going to have problems. But then whatever policy you have for gifts and entertainment is going to be challenged on some level. There'll be people constantly trying it. And so what was fascinating in this particular case was to say that we very quickly, where you've got personal motivation to kind of get around something, you can very quickly, even if you're in the compliance space, you can very quickly find yourself in that kind of like, I wonder if we could bend this or. And so the conclusion there is, if it's hard for us, imagine what it's like for people that don't think about these things or have huge motivations to bend and break these rules. So you get to a point where you look at it and say, if that's an easy trap for me to fall into, then imagine what's going to be happening within the business. And so we can start to see that that's a particularly challenging, even if you put the 0 limit in there, that's a particularly challenging rule. And so when we look at how we design things, it's almost like you want to be looking at what's the worst thing that could happen here. And the challenge with gifts and entertainment is I don't think there is a perfect policy. That almost by design, the fact that we're policing that area is going to lead to F-ups on some level. In other words, our risk appetite on this thing probably shouldn't be 0. We should probably be monitoring it. So you move into those sorts of conversations as well.
Yeah, I thought it was very effective to, from these stories, to move into bigger learnings about gifts and entertainment is a hot topic wherever I go in the last 25 years, because I think it has a lot to do because there's this human side and gifts and entertainment is a way to create relationships, and we don't want a complete clinical business relationships. Yes, we want to have meals together. We want to show appreciation with little thoughtful gifts. And then there's the slippery slope and the gray zone. When does it start to influence you? And there is research today that shows that it starts to influence you all the time and you don't notice it, but you tell yourself you're not influenced. So that's something I think that's very interesting to also remind people to tell them little stories. How there's this one study where some researchers tested, so what if the waiter gives you a mint? So then tip goes up. And if the waiter gives you 2 mints, tip goes up again. And if the waiter comes back, turns around and says, oh, for you nice people, there's an extra mint, then it's even more tip. Yeah. So these are little things that influence our behavior, and it's good to know about them before you accept anything. So my take is, yes, limits in a way. Sometimes it's also a legal regulation that you need to comply with, but mostly I would educate people what it does to them and give them some guidelines how to navigate this field. Because I'd
like to see that research updated to see what the impact is, the disapproving glare of a barista is when they turn that iPad around. Maybe you guys don't have this over here. Everything gets tips now. I'd love to see how tips are affected by that, barista's glare. What do you think the takeaways are? Because to your point, we're wildly influenced beyond what we can even comprehend. Like if you start to study behavioral science, there's that famous study of, people wrote down their social security numbers and then they had to guess how much a mug was worth. And the people whose social security number started with a big number, they were influenced just by seeing that big number, and they disproportionately guessed that mug was worth more. So what role do you think compliance has in navigating this gray, informed by these studies or informed by these behavioral science, axioms or principles that seem to come out of this research time and again?
So look, I think the key bit here is to recognize that what we are trying to do is to influence human beings, right? So if we look at, I always sort of say that compliance is the business of influencing human decision making. Why do I say that? Well, because you can do this, but it won't achieve it. You can say to an organization, a website, a legal entity, a building, a factory, you can go, be compliant, right, and hope that it responds in kind. It's the people within the organization, typically the employees, but we can think of suppliers and other stakeholders as also having an influence. Those are the people whose behaviors and decision making is going to determine whether the organization as a whole is compliance. So to get the organizational objective of being compliant requires us to influence the people within the organization. And then if we think about that as the challenge, well, we need to start understanding what makes people tick, not the reasons we would like people to think, not what I describe as, we can think about how we would like people to behave. We need to think of it as how they are likely to behave. Now, that doesn't mean we let them do whatever they want. What it means is recognizing that human decision-making isn't always driven by rational behavior. It's not always, we don't always make good decisions. We can be swayed by other people's circumstances, tiredness, all those kinds of things. And when we're looking at compliance, it's a very technical subject matter. And so often things that are obvious to us in the compliance function might not be obvious to people in the business. As I always say, they're not interested in compliance. I don't mean they want to be non-compliant. I mean, they're not passionate about the subject, because if they were, they'd be working in compliance. Right. So we know that we're dealing with people who might not have what we are trying to impose on them or encourage them to do uppermost in their minds. So if we then start to look at that, we can start to recognize this is not a simple game of tell people to do this or train them on it once and then hope that they remember it in the moment. We've got to recognize that there are going to be flaws, there are going to be times, and people get really creative about bending the rules and finding ways around things if they perceive that something is standing in their path. So our job is to, of course, educate them on what the rules are, but also recognize those times where human frailty, circumstance, incentives, all these kinds of things are going to come into play in a way that means our carefully crafted, brilliantly designed program of training, rules and controls might have weaknesses in that we haven't perceived. And so what I love about this particular story that I told was I'm sitting here going, I understand the rationale for the gifts and entertainment stuff. It just didn't occur to me, and I should have done, right? It just didn't occur to me to look at this. Now, if I understand this stuff and I'm not thinking in those terms, imagine somebody that isn't thinking, doesn't want to think in the business. And so it's just a really good illustration of the bigger challenges that we're facing. And so I think recognizing the fallibility of humans and recognizing that we're not going to be uppermost in their minds all the time, particularly if the thing you want them to comply with is highly technical, only kicks in certain circumstances, or there's a really good reason why they might not want it to kick in. Then we can start to see, well, how is our program designed more effectively? And so off this, this is just one illustration of, if we're going to talk about mistakes, that's just one set of conversations that you can have. Lots of other things we can learn as well.
So what advice would you give someone to try to pressure test, so to speak, their program or a policy that they're rolling out? Is it kind of a post-mortem or a pre-post-mortem? Kind of asking questions like, okay, if we roll this out and it falls flat and there's an epic F up, how did it happen? Is it that kind of a brainstorming exercise? Is it kind of something to do on your own, like some navel gazing on just trying to kind of think about, what might not be considered in the policy? You know what I'm kind of asking? How do we get out ahead of some of those things so that, again, I'm just using policies as an example in the context of the story you just told. How can we get out ahead of some of these potential F-ups and prevent them from occurring in the context of how human beings are actually going to navigate?
So for me, the most powerful approach I found so far comes from coaching, where before you do something where you want people to do something, you think really hard, what am I really aiming for? Let's take training completion. What am I aiming for? Am I aiming for having these high numbers that 90% of all people complete their training? Or am I aiming for that people really take something away from this, that they understand the policies better, that they have a better understanding of where the trigger points in the company are in their area? And then the next most important step is asking what's going on for them. Because only if you understand their context, like if you have a salesperson very fast going to all these meetings, worrying about that the competition might give nicer gifts and swoof away the clients, how can you help them understand that this is not the case, and even if it is, we have your back and you will not be punished for this? And how can I explain what needs to be done to keep them safe in a way that they don't have the feeling that you're slowing them down?
I'll give you a really simple way I look at these things, Nick. Think about whenever we introduce an intervention, right, which is the phrase that I use to cover an attempt to influence people's behavior. So that might be training, communications, controls, whatever it is, right? Whatever it is we're trying to use to get the outcome that we're looking for. Now, anytime we do something, there is always the risk of what in medical terms we call side effects, right? And you're not allowed to release drugs without declaring on the side of the packet what side effects it might have. And you watch the TV ads, right? And you get that very, very quickly spoken compliance bit where they tell you all the things that could happen if you take these particular drugs. Now, what's interesting about that in the medical context is that, of course, we call these side effects. There's no such thing as a side effect. It's just another effect. But we call it a side effect to try and, but this is the stuff that we don't want to have happening. And in compliance, we've got the same thing. Any form of communication, rule, policy, control can have unintended consequences. So the trick, I think, is to recognize what those might be upfront as you are introducing it. Don't say, we've written the perfect policy, the perfect rule, this is the perfect training. It's going, what might this do? And training, for example, you can put ideas into people's heads. We've seen this with communications, right? Telling them something lots of other people are doing, warning them not to do something, can have the effect of actually putting ideas into people's heads. So even the most well-intentioned thing could go wrong. A policy that's bendable, a policy that's breakable. How might somebody try and bend this policy? So I think an ethical hacking mindset that says, let's recognize that nothing we do is ever going to be 100% perfect. What are the unintended consequences? And how might you try and bend this particular rule? So if you were minded to get around this rule, and you might want to think about why you might want to try and get around this particular rule, but you could just go, what could go wrong here? Let's identify that. Now, because there are always going to be unintended consequences, nothing is perfect, you have to say to yourself, look, we'll go for the thing that offers the least number of those. And what we'll do is we'll monitor for those unintended consequences. But if we disclose those to ourselves up front, in other words, we introduce a policy and we go, we're not going to tell them this, but we kind of know that this has weaknesses here. You monitor for those things, and therefore you make it less likely those things will occur because you're paying attention to it. Then that's not going to cover everything. Then when things go wrong, to your second point, of course, you review what's happened. But you review it in two lights, I think. The first one is, of course, we hold people accountable for when they break the rules. But it is also worth looking at where the rules and the policies and so on and so forth have been badly designed. Is it, for example, that we have made things worse by the way that we communicated something, or maybe the training wasn't clear? And we also have to change those things. And all too often, the focus is on, here's some bad people that broke the rules. Our perfectly designed rules, and these awful people came along and broke it. We need to recognize where we are contributing to the problem and resolve it. So I like to use traffic logic. If you think about a stretch of road where there are lots of accidents, yes, we hold drivers accountable for the accidents that occur on that stretch of road, but we also say to ourselves, if this is a junction where there's lots of accidents happening, we can punish all those drivers, but if we don't do anything about the junction, we are still going to get more out. We can bring a whole load of new drivers in, same likelihood is going to occur. So we need to take accountability for our part in that, and that involves a little bit of recognizing that what we are trying to do is almost impossible, which is design a perfect framework that will cover every eventuality and that isn't restricting humans who may have incentives to try and get around those things. If we recognize the reality of those dynamics, we make it much less likely we're going to have problems. And when they do occur, we have a framework that we can start to go back and look at it and realistically resolve for the future. The typical response is they just need more training. Well, what happens if the training was part of the problem? Right? Giving them more of it is not a sensible way of solving it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this concept of externalities is important. It kind of feeds exactly into what you're talking about. So in economics, this is a concept that is kind of pervasive across everything. You throw a pebble in the pond, the externalities are the ripples that go out and, what happens on the shore on the other side of the lake or whatever. And so an example of, negative externalities is like if you put a park in a neighborhood, there's a bunch of positive things that come from it. There's a lot of good intentions for that. You want to create a community space and so forth. That could lead, though, to a negative externality of people at the park too late or music blaring that's disrupting those households that are near the park. So I think if we can think about things, to Christian's point, in through this sort of externality lens, and we can sort of foundationally assume that like everybody is like a rational actor, I think that's a safe thing to assume. That prevents us from falling into that trap that Bettina kind of referenced earlier, where everyone's good and bad, and if they violate something, they must be bad. I think if we can take more responsibility in what you called accountability, exhibit more agency, and sort of start with ourselves, like how is this thing that I wrote potentially driving some of these behaviors, or where are there opportunities in this thing that I rolled out to avoid these sort of negative externalities. That pulls some more agency into ourselves. It gives us a lot more ownership of the outcome that we, at the end of the day, may be kind of responsible for. And I think it'll help us to iterate through this, because I think all of these, no policies really etched in stone anymore, right? There's maybe 10 that are etched in stone. Everything else is kind of written in pencil. And those things we have to iterate through them, because the business changes, the stakeholder groups change, the risks that the organization faces change as well. So there's a comment from Wendy, and I'll go right back to you in a second, Bettina. But Wendy said, thanks for this comment, Wendy. She said that, these are good questions to ask and kind of analyzing where something went wrong. What are the pivot point indicators, or what are the pivot indicators? Things that could cause it to go sideways. What did we know, and when did we know it, that could have allowed us to pivot earlier? So again, having that kind of radar going and looking for outcomes that are maybe outside of what was expected can cause us to go back and iterate through that policy or that thing that we rolled out. Thanks for that, Wendy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What were you going to say, Bettina? Sorry to cut you off there.
Yeah, Nick, I get a lot of inspiration from teaching bachelors and parenting teenagers for compliance. And for me, what I observe a lot, because if you are an expert in compliance, or if you're a teacher or parent, you always think, but I told them 10 times. It's in the syllabus. It's in the policy. But that doesn't mean it has landed. And it's the first law of communication by Paul Watzlawick is the success of the communication is decided by the receiver. Yeah, so if you have not managed to explain your compliance issue in a way that people find it interesting and when to act on it, that's on you. And what I see a lot, and it's completely understandable and human, that as compliance people and parents and teachers, we get very frustrated because we feel, but I told them, it's written here, it's there. And there is another communication mantra that's very important that says, when you are so fed up what you just said, it's just starting to get understood by your target group. So you have to be relentlessly over communicating, and in a good way. So not showing, I told you 100 times and then you tell it again, but you always have to kind of show up and, hey, did you know? And make it interesting. And then over time, you might have a chance. That's just how it is.
And that's a great feed into actually. What we've done here, Nick, is just off one mistake. That's the conversation that we've just had, right? I'll just riff off what Bettina said and take us to another one, something that was covered this morning. It's just another sort of illustration. So somebody was explaining, because we were in the Asia Pacific region, somebody was talking about something that had happened in Australia, and they were not themselves Australian. And they had been working for a global firm, and they'd been sent into Australia to kind of do some training, right? I think effectively lay down the law. And the training that had been designed clearly hadn't been designed with an Australian audience in mind. And those of you that are familiar with Australians will know that there's a certain type of approach that is more effective in that country, right? They're very direct. And the individual was just saying they basically showed up with some training to do without having thought about the need to customize it for that audience. And so the response, very aggressive, was kind of like, who are you to tell us what to do? Well, an implication being, you don't know how this place works. And so the perfectly honed message from head office crashes and burns badly, much like the spaceship, I guess, that we're trying to repair, right? Crashes and burns badly on impact with a completely different country. Now, that's a very, very common error, right? It's something that you can see it even within the same, even within one location. Microcultures, what sounds good in the boardroom might not land well on the factory floor. What sounds good in one country might not feel good in another country. So messaging that's crafted by compliance might make perfect sense to compliance people, but you've got to say, and these people, what they were doing, what I loved about this Australian story was the response was very brutal and direct. Other cultures, they would think it, but they just wouldn't say it. And so the story we talked about there was exactly the point Bettina was making, was like, you've got to think about Like, how is this going to be received by your audience? And of course, if you're coming into a country, maybe you do need to change the way you talk about it. And so I felt quite sorry for this individual as they were telling this story, sort of parachuting into Australia and met with this stony face of aggressive people going, effectively, I'm not going to listen to you. And so that was an interesting example, again, of understanding the audience.
Anything to say on that, Bettina? Because I want to share a couple of comments here.
Yeah, I also watched a comment, so please go ahead.
Okay. So Kira said, thanks for this, Kira. This is a great point. She said, I think we're replete with cases. Replete means full of, okay? If you don't have word of the day going on your desk calendar there. I think we're replete with case studies of large scale / extreme failures like Boeing, Enron, Volkswagen. But I definitely see the value of being able to study more run-of-the-mill failures for which case studies aren't written. And I think that's really a lot of what we're talking about here. She said, I love this idea, Christina and Bettina, and she forgot to put me on there for some reason. But Jim followed up and he said, also, the big failures are often the result of a series of smaller run-of-the-mill failures. Planes don't often crash merely due to one mistake by the pilot. It usually involves a series of other smaller mistakes. And so I love this idea of us developing this sort of culture in this community of sharing these little failures, because again, you don't necessarily have to fall off the bike to learn how to ride it. And if you can learn from somebody else's failures, that's a way more efficient way to get a lesson than to, like I say, stub your toe or fall off the bike yourself. What were you going to say?
That's exactly our ambition for Christian and me, that we kind of in the long run create something like a huge database of little hiccups and how to prevent them, and maybe see if we can see some structures and create some tools to like checklist how to avoid hiccups, right? But yeah. I also wanted to say something about Doug's comment about the connection between speak up culture and talking about mistakes. And there's, of course, a strong connection, because people speak up when they feel that it's wanted, it's normal, it's safe and worthwhile. And if you, as a compliance person, do not model this and always make Mr. or Mrs. Perfect, then of course the barrier to come to you, the immaculate compliance person, gets higher. It's pretty logical. We do have data from an Ethicsverse study that shows if leaders talk about ethical issues frequently, then their people feel safer to speak up. So it's really, it's good to have those empirical studies, but basically we don't really need these empirical studies because we feel it.
Yeah, we feel it. And to that point, there's just so much benefit that comes from this because, Christian just said it, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. Like the plans never work. And I think we have a disproportionate concentration of perfectionists in our industry, more so than in sales. There, I said it. Okay. So like this perfectionism that got us to where we're at because we're focused on those details and things can't go wrong, and anything less than an A minus is an F, that kind of mentality. That serves us really well sort of in sort of our school time, right? But when you get into the real world, we need to shift into this sort of baseball mindset. And this analogy may fall flat to my European friends on the call here, but in baseball, you can make it into the Hall of Fame, striking out, getting out, not getting on base 2 out of 3 times. And if we bring a sort of brain surgeon's mentality to this messy thing that is compliance, where there's all these plans and we're dealing with human beings and there's cognitive errors that are wired into everybody's DNA, and we're putting out these policies and sort of trying to make sure that our organization lives up to those obligations, it can create not only some undue stress and cause us to sometimes create policies and sort of like risk mitigating approaches that are not really realistic, but it also it creates a headwind for the exact speak up that we need in order to do our job. And so I think reframing our speak up into, hey, this is not like snitches get stitches time. This is us getting risk intelligence, and risk can show up in lack of process adherence. It could show up in ethical wrongdoing. It could show up in policy violations. There's a wide array of risk intelligence that we can gain from these stakeholders. if we can couple that with a mentality that everything is not going to go perfect, and this is a game of iteration and continuous improvement, it gives us a lot more budget to experiment, but also reinforce this like error rate, which happens across every freaking business and every single department and every single, project and plan, that gives people a little bit more freedom to like be the human beings that they are, and thus unleash those God-given gifts that they have. So all this stuff is really related. And I think talking about these little F-ups in the context of our industry can, again, help us to push the ball forward a little bit faster. And when we can carry that out within our entire organization on, hey, here's a project that I released and it really kind of fell flat due to X, Y, and Z, or leaders talking about these ethical fails or these ethical issues, it really can sort of stoke the flames for this culture of integrity that we're trying to build.
And I think you made a really good, the comparison with sales, Nick, I think is excellent, because when a salesperson fails, they just don't sell, right? It's invisible, right? It's just, there is no sale. Whereas when a compliance person, an ethics person screws up, right? It's obvious. And so I think we have to recognize that every other function within the organization is on some level doing things that come with a failure rate attached. And so if we are disconnected from that, one, there's a risk that we're the sort of perfect oddballs on the side of the organization. That's not that doesn't sort of bring us into the rest of the organization. Everybody else is by default experimenting with what they do. And if we want to push compliance programs forward, right, we have to engage in trial and error. Right, so things are going to go wrong. We don't move our programs forward if we're not on some level screwing stuff up. Now, what you want to be really careful of course, is you want to make sure in the same way that we have rules internally that we don't want anybody, we don't want any employee ever breaching sanctions, right? That kind of thing comes with big amounts of problems. So just as that's important there, maybe we want to make sure that we're also experimenting in safe spaces and thinking about it and trying to avoid making mistakes where it's critical, but also cutting ourselves some slack when we do make mistakes, because that's when we learn from these things. And so I think the idea behind this looking at mistakes isn't just the detail of the individual story. There's a whole big picture philosophy of how do we make ourselves feel more part of the rest of the organization, more realistic, and recognize that businesses nowadays will only succeed if they are evolving, developing, testing things out. And so we need to join that particular bandwagon. Now, if we are testing stuff and we are always 100% successful, we are either delusional or we're not really testing anything.
Yeah, I also like the comparison with sales. And in sales, we can probably learn something from the sales mindset, where everybody knows it's a numbers game. It's normal that clients say no, but you just have to keep pushing. And you don't, you're kind of very resilient against rejection, and you never take it personal. It's just an additional challenge. And I think that will be, in a more compliance adapted way, that might be something that compliance could learn from.
There's a great comment from Rebecca. Rebecca, thanks for this. She said, if only we could speak openly and freely about the original circumstances that created the law, the rule, or the policy that gave rise to that law, rule, or policy. So often this is either embarrassing or privileged or a scenario that is materially different. And so it gets turned into, well, that isn't my situation, so I'm justified in this particular situation. What advice would you give? Really, this is kind of about providing context, kind of the why behind the what being the policy, the why being the violation or the issue. What advice would you give somebody to kind of, at some level, a policy is sort of leveraging an F up and is created to like avoid that in the future. But sometimes there's that sort of veil of privilege that prevents us from like sharing that why in a really clear way that can allow for and sort of drive some of that natural rationalization that the human being, look, we're all rationalization machines. It kind of gives them some fodder to rationalize and sort of work their way around that rule. What would you say to that?
I think this is one of the biggest risks that we inadvertently run, right? Which is the kind of like, because I said so type logic. And those of you kids will know that telling your kids to do something because I said so is the sort of last place you go when you have no other, just get on with it, right? You're tired, exhausted, you can't really be bothered to explain it. So we know as kids that anybody that sort of just says do this without giving any sensible explanation, they're sort of out of other excuses. And I think one of the things that we do hide behind is privilege, confidence. It's kind of like, I can't tell you. Well, people are curious, and particularly in the 21st century, we're hiring people to be smart and human and ask questions. And we talk, you talked a lot about AI before. but AI is coming in. AI doesn't have human emotions, right? We're hiring humans to have human emotions and display those human emotions in their job, to use nuance, judgment, emotional intelligence, right? They can read this situation. They're sentient. So the idea that we can kind of just shut them off by we can't talk about that, I think is really dangerous. So we have to find ways around that problem. Of course, we can't breach confidentiality. We've got to find stories. And that's where I think the storytelling that comes into the mistakes areas is also critical. Take an example of speak up or whistleblowing. One of the challenges with that particular process is that the average employee has no experience of that whatsoever. They don't know what the process will involve. They don't know what happens. They have, it's not an experience that they will ever have gone through. And so we can put in place all the logistics that you want for people to report things, but actually the question will remain, well, what happens? And we tend to say things like, well, we can't talk about live cases, blah, 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 and we can't reveal what happened because we want to protect the confidentiality of the whistleblower. Understandable, makes perfect sense, but that doesn't help the rest of the population. So Exactly. We've got to start to find vehicles to share stories, and that might be using personas, that might be using composite characters, that might be giving some form of details or explanation. We have to find our way around this, and we don't have to look too far in the world to find other ways that we explain things to people. Bettina's talked about teaching. We can think about, whether or not you're religious. The Bible is a good example of a text where there's lots of stories, right? We explain morality and ethics to people using stories, and that's how we connect with people. So I think a lot of this stuff is around developing that. And again, another reason for going through this process of talking about mistakes is we start to get to be able to explain things, and we recognize the power. As we are sharing the stories of our mistakes, we can see the power of storytelling. And so the other skill set that I think this idea of development isn't just about improving who we are, being honest about who we are, removing this idea of perfection. It's also recognizing the power of those basic human dynamics. The way that we have communicated from generation to generation is we have told stories. Social media is all on some level about stories. And so I think there's a whole load of things around this. And that's why we think it's really important to break through this taboo of not talking about stuff, because then there's a whole load of other taboos that we also need to break, including the one that you've just referenced, Nick, which is this idea that we can't possibly talk about it. We're not going to tell you. Well, why not, right? That's not compelling. People want to know, because if you need their buy-in, particularly when you can't see what they're doing or you need them to do things to a particular standard, then they need to trust you and recognize that what you're asking them to do is sensible and there's a basis for it. The other thing, if we can't explain it, it suggests that we don't understand it. So The other reason you would want to explain it to people is to sort of go, actually, look, I'm standing behind this. This is what it's there for. And if we find ourselves unable to explain it, maybe it's not a very good rule. Maybe it's badly designed. Maybe we should So again, valuable learning point for us.
And I think not figuring out a way to tell a story that's going to activate these human beings, these human sensors in the organization, I think it's a cop-out. I think it's akin to just saying, well, I'm just going to do a zero T&E, a zero gift and entertainment policy. Look, to your point, that's very easy, but it's not really that effective because of the realities of the world we live in. So we're kind of paid to be thoughtful. We're paid to be the headlights on the car to help our businesses see around the curve. And there's always a way that you can tell a story, or you can make up an anecdote, or you can, come up with a parable or give an example of the why behind the what, while maintaining the privacy and maintaining the, privileged, truth of the matter. To your point, that storytelling is such a way to get stuff unstuck and really frame out what the core of this, lesson in morality is. You know what I mean?
Well, and look, just because something is hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Like that is the job. And I think often people sort of go, well, it'd be really difficult for us to do whatever. I kind of go, that unfortunately, that's the challenge that you've got. And the reason this job, actually, the compliance and ethics roles are really interesting is it's not easy. It's complicated. It's confusing. It's messy. It requires a lot of thought. It requires a lot of effort. And of course, when you do it really well, the people you're doing it for don't even notice. It becomes invisible, right? So you effortlessly communicate stuff. We know that taking complicated things and making them simple, easy to understand, actionable, that's hard work. But that is the job. And so, in many respects, we want to try and make compliance and ethics as invisible as possible. It's just there. It's just the way we do business. And so that's the challenge that we face. And I think recognizing that means, back to the theme of making mistakes, We're going to get that wrong some of the time, right? We're going to have to, what might land with one audience isn't going to land with another one. So we've got to recognize, we're going to have to try things out, try new ideas. And by trying new ideas, we will land some amazing successes and we will mess it up big time. But that's part of the thing. And so I think also permission to experiment comes from this. When we talk about the fact we're trying new things, understand the nature of the job is difficult. If we explain why it's difficult, that also explains why we will occasionally get things wrong.
Good point. I mean, you know what else is hard? Making a baby. No, making the baby is the easy part. Having a baby, I've heard, is very hard. But that doesn't mean that you don't do it. There's a lot of joy that comes from that, actually, in both. So, we need to. I mean, that's the job that we have. There's no compliance program, like I said, that's etched in stone that doesn't need to be climbing this mountain of risk. And the weather patterns change and the slope of the grade that we're climbing is going to change. But it's our job to have continued forward pressure and understanding the fallibility, not just of the stakeholder groups that we're serving, but also of ourselves, can allow for, as you said, a lot more experimentation and a decrease in the time that new impact and more meaningful impact can be had within the company.
Yeah, there's an excellent point in the chat here about resourcing. And I think there is something it's interesting to talk about. I did a presentation recently in London to some compliance leaders. And I went, the surefire way that you can get the budget you're looking for is to mess up so badly that your successor gets it, right? So we get funded when things go horribly wrong. And one of the things that's interesting to note there is if you present this picture of perfection all the time and you kind of make it look like it's all okay, right, when it suddenly goes wrong, chances are you're going to be the one held responsible. But it comes out of the blue. It's like, well, hold on a minute. You guys told us you had this under control. And actually, often you have had it under control, but you've kind of covered up the things that have gone wrong. There is a healthy human narrative to making it clear, not that you're incompetent and always get things wrong, but every so often things don't go according to plan. And that's just the nature of the job, right? We're doing our job properly by screwing up from time to time. And that way, actually, you don't want the big blow-ups. But at least if you present this image of perfection, you're never going to get more budget, right? Because they'll think you're under control. So there's this fine line, I think, between looking incompetent, but also being honest about the situation. And again, that's something that we're trying to tease out in these exercises.
Well, and also what you're talking about is a muscle that all these other departments are really good at building, whether it's in a manufacturing setting, that production team, they have goals and sometimes they hit those goals and sometimes they don't hit those goals. Or a sales team, they have a quota for a particular quarter or a sales projection for the year and sometimes they hit them and sometimes they don't. So being able, acknowledging that something is falling short from the plan is a mere indication that like you're actually working. Because to your point, if everything is hunky-dory, well, then where is the opportunity for improvement? How does continuous improvement even play into a program like that? Well, I mean, it's totally fake, right? Like there's always something that you can improve. And I think part of it might be kind of reframing that we are not responsible for compliance. How can we be? We don't control all the human beings that we're, serving, so to speak. We're responsible for creating more compliance within the organization, or we're responsible for creating the circumstances for compliant behavior and improved business quality throughout the organization. And I think that reframe can allow us to kind of extinguish some of that, natural self-preservation that we're all wired with. That's the foundation of, Maslow's hierarchy that we're all subject to, and allow us to be a little bit more transparent to, again, shine a light on those gaps that exist in our programs or shine a light on the gaps that exist in the compliance across the employee base that we're, quote unquote, responsible for.
Yeah, Nick, we're running out of time, I'm conscious. Is it worth us just dropping in a few hints as people think about this topic?
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time looking at this. We spent a lot of time crafting these events. So if people are interested, obviously get in touch with us. We're going to be running more of these sorts of things. But the one thing I would say is that if you're going to do these sorts of exercises, do not expect it to happen of its own accord, right? So we spent a lot of time crafting psychological safety. That's why, for example, we talk first about the sorts of things that we have got wrong. Don't expect these constructs just to work. If you just say to people, you confess your mistakes, that is quite a challenging thing. So it requires giving real thought, and that requires thinking about, if you're going to create a sort of psychologically safe space, think about how do you do that? How do you communicate that? How do you role model that? And then what do you do with the discussion afterwards? Because if people are revealing things, you don't want to have a sort of critical, it needs to be an environment where people can feel free to share, not being criticized. Questions are asked in a manner that's constructive. So if you are going to do this kind of thing, our advice would be really tread carefully, because you're unleashing something that is not a natural dynamic for the function for the reasons that Bettina's outlined. So tread incredibly carefully. We are happy to help and talk to anyone about that, but that's just the top tip I would give. Bettina, I don't know if you have anything to add.
silence is silence. So it doesn't look like she does. Maybe she cut out there. But I encourage you to share, these F-ups with your team. Share them internally. Share them with the board. I think it builds a lot of trust. And again, opens people's mind to the fact that they don't have to be perfect, because perfection is an ideal. While it's, noble to pursue, is never going to be achieved. And I think that gap, or that room that this kind of a conversation creates for us, allows for a lot more experimentation. And how bad's it really going to go? You know what I mean? It's a bunch of these little failures that we can start to, or the potential for these little failures. When we can extinguish those little risks, it can really prevent us from turning into one of these extreme failures that hits across the headlines. But it's on us to drive this thing forward. And so let's get one more emoji explosion for the one and only Christian Hunt and the one and only Bettina Palazzo. Bettina, it looks like you're back. Anything to add?
It wouldn't be a session on F-ups, Nick, if we didn't have one right at the end.
This was planned, okay? This was all part of the show, okay? This is all part of the plan. Let's see what we did. We broke our goal of 5,000, you guys. Amazing. I love it. If you missed the compliance party bus on Tuesday, check out the YouTube channel. You got to follow this YouTube channel. And if you are not following Christian and Bettina on LinkedIn, that's a great place to start as well. We will see you all next time. Love you all. Take care.